a promise or a prophecy in the text, and then later the prophet comes back and he says, and this was fulfilled. And you really find a great example of this in the book of Joshua. In the book of Joshua, in chapter 1 of Joshua, the Lord makes a promise to Joshua, and it is conditional, but it's based on the promise that he'd made to Abraham, right? God made a promise to Abraham in chapter 12, chapter 15 of Genesis, that he was going to give a certain piece of real estate to Abraham and to his descendants. And so Moses goes throughout his life, and in around 1400, Moses dies, Joshua takes over. And God says to Joshua in chapter 1, verse 8, he said, this book of the law will not depart out of your mouth. And he says, if you will meditate on it day and night, I will give you good success. And every place that you put your foot, I'm going to give you as a part of the promised land that I promised to Abraham. And so you go through the book of Joshua, you have all these great battles and all these wonderful stories. But you get back to chapter 21 of the book of Joshua, and Joshua interprets this promise and this prediction. He actually interprets it for us as the reader. And he says in chapter 21 in verse 43 through 45, thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he swore to give to their fathers, and having taken possession of it, they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all of their enemies in their hands. Not one of all the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. Everything came to pass. So there you have it in verse 45, that Joshua interprets this prophecy himself. And he says, you know what? Everything God promised, everything God predicted he was going to give, he gave. And so one of the things you want to be quite cognizant of as you're reading through the prophets is, does the prophet utter something and then later come back and interpret what he had earlier said and say, and this was to fulfill what had happened? And you find this happening at times through the scriptures. A fourth kind of fulfillment we want to consider is what I would call fulfillment by analogy or analogical fulfillment. And what this means is that something may happen and the prophet will ask people to think back to the history of the people of God, and he will say, oh yeah, this is like what happened back then. You find this, for instance, Jesus does this often. Isaiah did it. Isaiah encouraged people to think back to Noah. Jesus encouraged people to think back to Noah. But the one that is, I think, very interesting has to do with Jesus comparing himself to Jonah. You recall that Jesus is having arguments with some of the Jewish leaders, and he refers them back to Jonah because they're looking for a sign that he really is the Messiah. He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, I'm not going to give you a sign. God's not going to give you a sign except the sign of Jonah. And then he gives this prediction that is a prediction that's fulfilled by analogy. And what he says is, all right, just like Jonah was 3 days and nights in the belly of the whale, the Son of Man is going to be 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth, and then he's going to be raised up. And so you have this picture then of Jesus as a fulfillment of something that we didn't even recognize when it happened in the book of Jonah, that was kind of a picture in very veiled forms of what it was going to be like for Jesus to be in the heart of the earth and then to be resurrected and raised from the dead. And that is, Jonah came out of the mouth of the fish, and Jesus came out of the heart of the earth there in the resurrection. So we have these fulfillments by analogy that you don't want to miss. And the way you know that you're looking at a prediction that may be analogical is, and a fulfillment that may be analogical, is that the prophet will mention something in the history of the people of God. You find this in Luke 21 and Matthew 24 and Mark 13, where Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation, where he's looking back to this man of lawlessness that was probably Antiochus Epiphanes back in the 160s before the coming of Jesus. And he says, Jesus says, what's going to happen in the future is going to be like what was happening back then. And so Jesus is encouraging his people to look for fulfillments that are kind of parallel to what they saw earlier in the history of the people of God. And so this is the fulfillment by analogy. Then one other thing you want to think about that is kind of a relative principle of fulfillment of prophecy. And you can't be ironclad with this, but again, you can look at it as principle, is we want to look at the simplest and nearest fulfillment to whatever the prophet says in his own day. Because the prophet, God is using these people to speak into historical circumstances. If you think of the way God has worked in your life, when God really brings a word to you that really makes a difference in your life, and you say, wow, that was a prophetic word. Well, it's something that's happening right there and right then to you. And I think that as we're reading these prophets, we want to consider that probably where God is expecting the reader to interpret fulfillments are closest to when the prophet spoke. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 29, Isaiah's predicting the coming of a group of people that are going to be very harsh with the people of God, and yet God's going to deal with them. And you find that could either be the Assyrians who would come in the 700s, or the Babylonians who would come much later. And probably good form in interpreting that prophecy there in Isaiah 29 would be to interpret it as the Assyrians coming, because they're so much closer to the time where Isaiah predicts than the coming of the Babylonians. So you want to consider that in the fulfillment of prediction as well, because a lot of times you look and there could be a lot of very parallel kinds of things that happen down the road in the history of the nation of Israel and Judah. And we have to ask ourselves, well, I wonder which one of these things it could be. And quite honestly, sometimes it could be that you're having even fulfillments by analogy after you have one really specific fulfillment. So you want to consider that. And again, if we go back to the heart of God, what's God trying to do with people? Well, what he's trying to do with people is to minister into their circumstance and history and into their time of what they're doing at that time in the history of the people in their own personal lives. And in order to do that, it really needs to be relevant, close to the time of the prophet. We will be back in the next session. We'll look at some more fulfillments.